First story, The Voice That Haunts Us. It all started on a normal school day, the kind that blends into the others until it doesn't. I was 12 at the time, and we were in the middle of our mid-morning break at Ariel School. It was sunny, and most of us were out in the yard, either playing or chatting. I remember a sudden shift, like the air thickened with something I couldn't place. A few of the younger kids screamed, and at first, we thought they were just messing around. But when we looked to where they pointed, a clearing beyond the schoolyard fence, we froze. There were figures. Small, dark figures standing near a strange silver craft that seemed too bright and smooth, like nothing I'd ever seen. They didn't move at first, just stood there watching us. Their eyes were the most unsettling thing, huge, black, and reflective, almost like mirrors. It felt like they were looking right into me, even though I was standing at the back of the group. Some of the braver kids got closer, crossing the fence despite the teacher's warnings to stay in the yard. That's when it got stranger. A few of the kids swore they heard the figures talking, but not with their mouths. It was more like the words just appeared in their heads, crystal clear, like a thought you didn't think yourself. They told us not to be afraid, that they weren't here to hurt us. At the time, it felt calming, almost peaceful, and I remember feeling drawn to them, even though my gut told me to stay back. The silver craft emitted a low hum, almost like a vibration you could feel in your chest. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they left, disappearing into the sky without a sound. I thought that would be the end of it, just a weird memory we'd laugh about later, but it wasn't. That night, everything changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't fear keeping me up, at least, not at first. I kept replaying the day in my head, the way the figures stood motionless, the soundless way they left. But as the hours dragged on, my thoughts became heavier, darker. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came, vivid and suffocating. I was standing back in the schoolyard, alone this time, but I could feel those eyes on me again, boring into my mind. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. Then I heard it, the voice. It wasn't speaking any language I knew, but somehow I understood it perfectly. Open your eyes. The words echoed endlessly, each repetition louder and more urgent. I woke up gasping, my chest tight, drenched in sweat. I thought it was just a nightmare, but when I went to school the next morning, I realized I wasn't the only one. Everyone was quiet that day. Even the kids who were usually loud and restless sat still, their eyes darting around like they were afraid to look at anything for too long. During lunch, I overheard a group talking in hushed voices. My stomach dropped when I heard one of them say, "The voice told me to open my eyes." It wasn't just me. One by one, others started admitting they'd had the same dream, or something eerily similar. The details varied, but the voice, the words, were always the same. It was like they were planted in our heads. Some of the kids cried when they shared their stories, while others refused to talk about it at all. A few of us decided it was just a coincidence, but deep down, we all knew better. This wasn't normal, and the worst part, the dreams didn't stop. They only got worse. The second night was worse. I went to bed dreading sleep, but exhaustion eventually won. The dream picked up right where it left off, as if I'd never woken up. This time, I wasn't in the schoolyard anymore. I was somewhere, darker, colder, with a sky that seemed too big, filled with stars I didn't recognize. The air felt heavy, and the silence was unbearable, until the voice came back. "Open your eyes," it said, more forcefully this time. I tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but no sound came out of my mouth. The voice didn't wait for an answer. Instead, images started flashing in my mind, chaotic and disjointed. I saw forests burning, oceans rising, and cities crumbling into dust. Then came the figures, the same ones from the schoolyard. They stood motionless in the chaos, their eyes fixed on me. I woke up with a scream lodged in my throat, only to realize I wasn't alone. My younger brother, who shared the room with me, was wide awake, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. He told me I'd been talking in my sleep, repeating the same thing over and over. They're watching. At school, the atmosphere was suffocating. More kids came forward, admitting they'd had the dreams too. The details varied slightly, but the essence was the same. The voice, the command, and those overwhelming images of destruction. It wasn't just the kids who had seen the figures either. Even some who hadn't been outside that day were now reporting nightmares. One boy swore he woke up with strange marks on his arm, 3 small dots in a perfect triangle, but he refused to show anyone. The teachers noticed something was off, but they chalked it up to overactive imaginations. They didn't see what we saw. They didn't hear the whispers in the hallways or notice how the laughter had disappeared entirely. The dreams followed us everywhere, bleeding into the daytime. We'd catch ourselves zoning out, staring into nothing, and then snap back to reality, unsure how long we'd been gone. Some kids started skipping school entirely, too afraid to sleep at night or face the growing unease that seemed to cling to the walls of Ariel. Whatever had happened in that clearing wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the 3rd night, I didn't even try to fight it anymore. The second my eyes closed, I was there again, in that impossible place with the alien sky and oppressive silence. This time it felt different, though. The dream wasn't just something I was experiencing. It was something I was being forced into. I couldn't tell if I was asleep or awake, and it terrified me. The voice came sooner this time, sharper, almost impatient. "Open your eyes," it demanded, over and over, like a hammer striking my skull. I wanted to scream, to ask what it wanted from me, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt myself moving, being pulled toward something in the distance. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A presence, massive and overwhelming, like it was pressing down on me from every angle. The images came again, more vivid than before. Endless deserts swallowing cities, floods consuming entire continents, and always those eyes, watching silently, unblinking. I woke up choking, my chest heaving like I'd been drowning. At school, things had escalated. One girl, Natasha, fainted during class. When she came to, she was hysterical, screaming about them coming back. The teachers tried to calm her down, but it only made things worse. She said they were in her head, showing her things she couldn't unsee. After that, the school finally called in our parents, but they didn't have any answers either. Most of the adults dismissed us, saying it was just a shared trauma or a prank that had gotten out of hand. But there were whispers among some of the staff, hints that they were just as scared as we were but didn't know what to do. The worst part was the dreams weren't just staying in our sleep anymore. Kids started reporting strange things happening when they were awake. A boy in my class swore he saw one of the figures standing outside his window at night just staring at him. Another said she heard the hum of the craft in the middle of the day, even though no one else could hear it. It felt like the walls were closing in, and no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves it wasn't real, something deep inside us knew it was. The 4th night was the breaking point for me. I tried everything to stay awake, coffee, pacing, even slapping myself, but my body gave in eventually. As soon as I drifted off, I felt it again, that pull, dragging me back to the same desolate place. But this time, the figures weren't just watching from a distance. They were closer, circling me. Their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, but their eyes, those eyes felt like they were peeling me apart from the inside out. The voice was louder now, no longer a calm whisper. It was a command, relentless and impossible to ignore. "Open your eyes," it roared, the words vibrating through my entire body. I screamed back, telling it to stop, but the images came anyway, faster, more violent. The destruction was no longer abstract. I saw faces now, people I knew, my parents, my friends, my classmates. All of them were trapped in the chaos, reaching out to me like I could save them. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Everything went black, and I woke up on the floor of my room. My nose was bleeding, and my ears were ringing like I'd been hit by something. The next day I didn't want to go to school, but my mom insisted. She didn't believe me when I tried to explain what was happening. "It's just nightmares," she said. "Everyone gets them." But this wasn't just me. When I got to school, it was clear the others were barely hanging on too. Natasha wasn't there, and rumors spread that her parents had pulled her out completely after she tried to hurt herself. I didn't blame them. Whatever this was, it wasn't letting go of us. During recess, a few of us gathered near the spot where we'd first seen the figures. Nobody wanted to be there, but it was like we couldn't stay away either. One of the boys, Daniel, said he'd been hearing the voice even when he was awake now. "It's not just dreams anymore," he whispered, his face pale and sweaty. "They're inside our heads. They're waiting for something." None of us knew what to say, but we all felt it too. That sense that something worse was coming, something we couldn't stop. That night, I didn't even bother trying to fight sleep. What was the point? The second my eyes closed, I was back, in that cold, lifeless expanse. But this time it was different. There was no voice at first, no images or chaos, just silence. I stood there looking around, but there was nothing, just the void stretching endlessly in every direction. Then, one by one, they appeared. Dozens of the figures surrounding me in a perfect circle. Their movements were synchronized, almost mechanical, and yet their eyes were alive, piercing, and full of purpose. I felt myself shrinking under their gaze, like they could see every thought I'd ever had, every fear I'd ever hidden. Finally, the voice came, but it was different this time, colder, more direct. "You are blind," it said. "Open your eyes." The command was followed by a surge of images, more vivid and horrifying than before. But these weren't just visions of destruction. They were warnings. Machines rising from oceans, skies darkening with ash, and countless figures, like the ones in front of me, walking among us. I woke up shaking, tears streaming down my face, but I couldn't remember all the details. It was like parts of the dream had been erased, leaving only fragments behind. The next morning, the atmosphere at school was suffocating. Kids were breaking down left and right. Some were too scared to talk. Others wouldn't stop talking about what they'd seen. Everyone's dreams seemed to be escalating, like we were all being pushed toward something we didn't understand. I caught up with Daniel during lunch, and he looked worse than ever. Dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling as he spoke. "They're not just in our dreams," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw one last night, in my room." He described waking up to find one of the figures standing at the foot of his bed, its massive black eyes locked onto his. He couldn't move or scream. He just lay there, paralyzed, until it finally vanished. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that it was just the dreams messing with his head, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he wasn't lying. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every shadow in my room felt alive, every creak of the house like footsteps. It was as if they were closing in, waiting for the perfect moment to show themselves again. By the fifth night, it was impossible to ignore anymore. Whatever this was, it had taken over our lives. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but it didn't matter. Even when I was awake, I felt them. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, whispers echoed in the back of my mind, and that hum, low and steady, seemed to follow me everywhere. My parents thought I was losing it, and maybe they were right. But when I got to school that morning, it was clear I wasn't the only one spiraling. A few kids didn't even show up anymore, and those of us who did looked like zombies. During our first break, I found a group huddled near the back of the field, whispering frantically. They'd heard something during the night, a deep vibration, like the sound of the craft, but coming from the ground this time. One girl swore her dog wouldn't stop barking at the backyard until sunrise. Another said they'd seen flashing lights in the woods behind their house. It was everywhere now, and no one could escape it. That night I finally gave in. The moment I closed my eyes, I was there again. But this time it felt like I wasn't alone. I could hear breathing, my own maybe, but it felt louder, closer. The figures didn't appear right away, but I knew. They were watching. The voice came back, softer now, but still relentless. "Open your eyes," it said. I wanted to scream, to tell it I couldn't, but my mouth wouldn't move. Suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to vanish, and I was falling. No, floating toward something vast and dark. Then they came. Dozens of figures circling me, their movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't tell if they were angry, curious, or something else entirely. The voice came again, louder now, as if it was inside my head. "We warned you. You do not see." Before I could process what it meant, I was overwhelmed by another surge of images. They were clearer this time, almost real. Cities abandoned, skies thick with smoke, and those black eyes, always watching. Then everything stopped. I woke up with a start, my body drenched in sweat, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The next day, the school was almost empty. Only a handful of kids showed up, and even they looked like they'd been dragged through hell. Natasha's name came up again. Rumor had it she'd been taken to a hospital after her parents found her trying to claw at her own eyes. No one wanted to talk about it openly, but we all knew it had something to do with the dreams. I overheard one of the teachers whispering to another about calling in specialists, but no one seemed to know what kind of help we needed. At lunch, Daniel pulled me aside, his voice shaking. "This isn't going to stop," he said, his eyes darting around like he expected one of the figures to appear at any second. "They're trying to show us something, but we're not listening." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Whatever they were doing to us, it felt like a warning, but for what? And why us? We were just kids at a school in the middle of nowhere. That night, I didn't fight the dreams. I let them come, hoping I'd finally get some answers. This time, the experience was almost peaceful at first. The figures were there, but they didn't move or speak. They just stood, their eyes locked on me, as if waiting. Then, the voice came one last time, softer than ever. "Open your eyes," it said. And for the first time, I understood. It wasn't talking about my physical eyes. It was something deeper, something I didn't fully grasp but could feel in my bones. The images came again, but now they felt different, almost like memories of a future that hadn't happened yet. When I woke up, the hum was still there, faint but unmistakable. The next day at school, everything was normal. No one talked about the dreams. The fear was gone, but so was the sense of connection we'd all shared. It was like a switch had been flipped, and we were back to being ordinary kids. But I'll never forget those nights, or the feeling that they're still watching, waiting for us to figure out what they tried to show us. Second story, The Desert's Secret. It's been years since that day in the Kalahari Desert, But every time I close my eyes, it's like I'm still there. I was one of the 2 pilots sent out on what should have been a routine intercept mission. We were chasing a radar anomaly, an unidentified aircraft according to the briefing. By the time we got visuals, there was nothing ordinary about it. This thing was massive, metallic, and moved like no aircraft I'd ever seen. It darted through the sky, impossible to predict, and when we finally locked on and fired, I swear it didn't go down. It just descended, like it allowed itself to crash. We circled back to where it fell, deep in the desert, and that's when things took a turn I can't explain. The crash site wasn't like any wreckage I'd seen in my career. There was no fire, no smoke, just a sleek, impossibly intact structure lodged halfway into the sand, like it had sliced through the earth without resistance. Command ordered us to land nearby and secure the area until ground teams arrived. That's when it started. First, it was the strange metallic hum. At first, I thought it was some kind of machinery still running in the ship, but the sound wasn't coming from the crash. It was in my ears, like it was drilling straight into my head. I remember looking at my co-pilot, and he was pale as a ghost. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, but neither of us said another word. It was as if we knew something was wrong, but we were too scared to name it. When the ground team arrived, they moved with precision, like they'd seen this kind of thing before. No questions, no hesitation. They cordoned off the site, and one of them waved us back to our jet. "You're done here," he said flatly. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by the ground crew, or even from the wreckage, but from something beyond that. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, dark shapes just out of focus, darting across the dunes. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of desert. My co-pilot must have noticed it too, because he muttered, "Do you see them?" His voice was shaking. Back in the cockpit, things only got worse. The metallic hum followed us, growing louder as we climbed. It was unbearable, like it was inside my skull, not just in my ears. And then came the lights. At first, I thought they were instruments malfunctioning, flickers on the HUD, faint glows on the control panels. But when I blinked, the lights were gone, only to reappear in the corner of my eye. The flight back was a blur of fear and confusion. Neither of us spoke, and by the time we landed, I was convinced something had followed us. We debriefed as best we could, but every word felt hollow. No one seemed interested in what we'd experienced. They just wanted technical details about the object. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being dismissed, like they knew something we didn't. That night, the nightmares began. And the sounds, the metallic drilling, they never left. That first night after the mission, I barely slept. The hum in my ears didn't stop, not even for a second. It was like my skull had become an amplifier for something I couldn't turn off. Lying in bed, I started to notice shadows moving across my room. At first, I thought it was just my mind, playing tricks on me. I mean, after what we'd seen, who wouldn't be jumpy? But then one of the shadows stopped. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it had a shape, a figure. It stood in the corner of the room, motionless, staring at me. Or, at least that's what it felt like. My chest tightened and I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, like something was holding me in place. When I finally managed to turn on the bedside lamp, the shadow was gone, but the feeling wasn't. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, staring at the walls, too, afraid to close my eyes. The next day, I called my co-pilot to see if he'd experienced anything similar. His voice was hushed, like he didn't want anyone overhearing. "It's not just you," he said. "They're in my house too, watching, waiting." That was all he'd say before hanging up. I remember sitting there with the phone in my hand, realizing this wasn't over. Whatever had been out there in the desert, it had followed us home. Over the next few days, the hum became more than just a sound. It was like it was alive, burrowing deeper into my head, making it impossible to think clearly. I started noticing patterns in the noise, strange rhythms that felt almost intentional. Worse than that, the figures began appearing during the day. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow passing behind me in the reflection of a window, a dark shape standing at the edge of the road as I drove. But they never stayed long enough for me to truly see them. It was maddening. I began to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether any of it was real or if my mind was breaking under the weight of the mission. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the kitchen trying to piece everything together, my dog started growling at the corner of the room. It wasn't the usual bark. This was low, guttural, like she was terrified. I turned to look, and there it was again. The figure. It was taller than any human, with a body that seemed to shimmer and distort, like it wasn't fully in this world. My dog bolted, yelping as she ran to the other side of the house. I didn't even think. I grabbed a knife from the counter and stepped toward it, but before I could get close, it vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. That was the moment. I knew this wasn't my imagination. These things, whatever they were real, and they weren't going to leave me alone. I tried reporting what was happening to someone higher up in the chain of command. I figured, after what we saw in the desert, they might have some answers, or at least believe me. But the response I got made my stomach sink. The officer on the other end of the line acted like I was delusional, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened at all. "You're probably just stressed," he said, his tone dismissive. "Take some time off, get some rest." Rest? How was I supposed to rest when I couldn't even close my eyes without seeing them? I hung up, furious, and that's when it hit me. They knew. They knew exactly what we had encountered and didn't want anyone talking about it. That night, the activity escalated. I woke up to the sound of static, like an old TV tuned to a dead channel, but it wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was inside my head. Along with the hum, I could now hear whispers, faint but insistent. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they carried a kind of urgency, like they were trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I stumbled out of bed, desperate to escape the noise, and that's when I saw them again. 3 figures standing at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat as they tilted their heads in unison, like they were studying me. Their bodies were dark, featureless, but their presence was suffocating. I blinked and they were gone, but the air in the room felt heavier, almost toxic, like whatever they were had left something behind. The next morning I noticed something strange. There were marks on my body, tiny circular scars I hadn't seen before. They were clustered on my forearm and ankle, precise and evenly spaced, like punctures from some kind of tool. I called my co-pilot again, desperate for answers. He sounded worse than before, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been inside," he said. "I woke up last night and I couldn't move. They were standing over me, touching me, but I couldn't fight back. I couldn't even scream." My stomach turned as he described the same marks I'd found on myself, as if they were tagging us like animals. "It's like we never left that desert," he said, "like they still have us." I couldn't shake the feeling he was right. Every night felt like a continuation of what had started in the Kalahari. The figures grew bolder, staying longer, getting closer. The whispers turned into full-blown voices, speaking directly into my mind, filling my head with images I couldn't comprehend. Flashes of strange landscapes, machinery, and eyes. Always eyes. They were watching, observing, as if we were part of some experiment that never ended. By this point, I stopped trying to tell anyone else. What was the point? No one would believe me, and I wasn't sure I believed myself anymore. But the fear, that was real. It was consuming me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something worse happened. The nights became a battle for survival, not against an intruder I could fight, but against the unrelenting presence that invaded every corner of my mind. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt it again. That paralysis, the complete inability to move or even cry out. My eyes darted around the room, the only part of me I could control, and that's when I saw them again. This time, there were more of them, at least 5, standing in a semicircle around my bed. They were closer than ever, their distorted shapes flickering like a bad signal on a screen. I could feel their gaze, not just on my body, but inside my head, probing, searching. My heart raced as they leaned in, and for the first time I noticed a faint glow emanating from their bodies, like dim blue light through a fog. I don't know how long they stood there, but when I finally regained control of my body, the room was empty again, though the air still felt thick, charged. I stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to splash cold water on my face, and that's when I saw it. A bruise-like mark stretching across my chest. It wasn't just a discoloration. It had a pattern, lines, almost geometric, like something burned into my skin. I ran my fingers over it, and a jolt of pain shot through me unlike anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just my body they were invading. They were leaving their mark, branding me like property. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what they wanted, why they wouldn't leave me alone. I spent hours scouring forums, reading accounts from others who claimed to have experienced similar encounters. The details varied, but the patterns were there. The hum, the paralysis, the marks. Some even described the figures exactly as I'd seen them. The more I read, the more I realized how many people had gone through something like this and were just as lost as I was. But the most terrifying part? No one seemed to have an answer. There were theories, experiments, interdimensional beings, even military involvement, but nothing concrete. And the more I looked for answers, the worse the experiences became. One night, as I was reading yet another forum post, my laptop suddenly shut off. The power in my house flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went completely dark. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and then I heard it. The metallic hum, louder than it had ever been, reverberating through the walls. My entire body felt like it was vibrating, like the sound was ripping me apart from the inside. And then they were there again. This time they didn't wait for me to notice them. They appeared in the middle of the room, shimmering, towering, and for the first time I could feel them in my mind. They weren't just watching, they were speaking to me, or at least trying to. Their thoughts weren't words, but overwhelming waves of emotion, curiosity, indifference, control. It was like they were telling me I didn't matter, that I was just another specimen in their endless study. The worst part wasn't the figures or even the messages they forced into my mind. It was the way they made me feel completely powerless. That night, as I sat frozen in my chair, unable to move while they surrounded me, I realized they weren't just observing me anymore. They were testing something. I could feel pressure building in my skull, like my mind was being stretched to its limits. The images came faster this time. Machines, landscapes, strange symbols that burned themselves into my memory. I wasn't just seeing them, I was experiencing them, as if I'd been dragged into another reality altogether. And just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures disappeared, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I don't remember much of the rest of that night. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The house was eerily silent, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over. But then, I saw the bruises again, this time on both arms and across my shoulders. They were darker now, the geometric patterns more pronounced, almost glowing faintly under the light. My head throbbed, and the hum was back, quieter but still, persistent, like a distant alarm I couldn't shut off. That's when I realized they weren't just following me anymore. They were inside me. Whatever they'd done in that desert, whatever they'd started, wasn't finished. It was like I was a part of them now, or worse, like they were a part of me. I stopped leaving the house after that. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, like they were watching me from every shadow, every corner of my peripheral vision. My co-pilot tried reaching out again, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That we'd been marked? That they were still with us? I wasn't even sure how much of it was real anymore. I stopped eating, barely slept, and spent most of my time sitting in the dark, waiting for the next encounter. They didn't come every night, but the fear that they might was enough to keep me on edge constantly. And then one night, everything changed. I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of my living room, disoriented and freezing. My feet were bare, covered in dirt and sand. Sand. My heart sank as I realized where it must have come from. Somehow, I'd been back to the desert. At least that's the only explanation that made sense. But how? My memory of the night was blank, as if someone had erased it. The metallic hum was deafening now, and I felt something heavy in my hand. I looked down and saw a smooth black object, small enough to fit in my palm, its surface covered in the same patterns as the marks on my body. I don't know how it got there, and to this day I haven't told anyone about it. But I know one thing for certain. Whatever happened in the Kalahari didn't end there. It's still happening, and I don't think it'll ever stop. The black object felt warm to the touch, almost pulsing, like it was alive. I didn't know what to do with it, throw it away, destroy it, or keep it hidden. Something inside me told me it was important, but the thought of holding on to it terrified me. I wrapped it in a towel and shoved it into the back of a drawer, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But even after it was tucked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still connected to me somehow. The hum in my ears grew louder, more erratic, like the object was amplifying whatever link I had to them. That night, I dreamed, or at least I think I did. I was back in the desert, standing on the edge of the crash site, but it looked different now. The wreckage was gone, replaced by an enormous circular structure that seemed to rise out of the sand. The air felt electric, heavy with tension, and the same figures were there, standing in a line before me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. One of them stepped forward, raising a long, thin arm, and pointed directly at me. In that moment, I felt my body being pulled apart. Not physically, but mentally, like they were peeling back the layers of my thoughts, my memories, my identity. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, but the feeling didn't fade. It was like a piece of me was still out there with them, trapped in that place. The dreams, or whatever they were, kept coming, more vivid and horrifying each time. They weren't just nightmares. They felt like experiences, like I was being dragged into their world against my will. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that desert, surrounded by the figures, feeling their cold, invasive presence. I tried staying awake for as long as I could, but the longer I stayed conscious, the stronger the hum became, like it was punishing me for resisting. My body was falling apart. I could barely eat. My hands trembled constantly, and every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and haunted. One night, as I sat in the living room trying to keep myself awake, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the hum became a deep, vibrating drone that shook the walls. Then, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the gloom. That's when I saw them. They weren't just in the corners of the room anymore. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, their dark, shifting forms blending into the shadows. They didn't move or speak, but their presence was overwhelming, like they were waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone, leaving me alone in the silence. But I knew they hadn't really left. They never left. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself that I could escape this. Whatever happened in the Kalahari had left a permanent scar, not just on my body, but on my entire existence. The figures weren't just visitors. They had become a part of my life, a shadow I couldn't outrun. The black object in the drawer seemed to call to me, its presence growing heavier every day, like it was trying to pull me toward something I didn't want to face. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took it out, holding it under the dim light of my desk lamp, and for the first time, I noticed that the patterns on its surface were shifting, moving like liquid trapped beneath glass. I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more the patterns began to make sense, not as shapes, but as something alive. They pulsed in time with the hum in my ears, syncing perfectly, as if the object and I were connected on some deeper level. Then it hit me. This wasn't just some alien artifact. It was a beacon, a tether, keeping me tied to them. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't let it stay in my house, couldn't let it keep drawing them to me. I drove out to a nearby lake in the dead of night, clutching the object in my shaking hands, determined to get rid of it. But as I stood at the water's edge, ready to throw it as far as I could, something stopped me. The hum became deafening, and for a moment I swore I could hear their voices again, faint but unmistakable. Don't. I froze, my arm mid-swing, as the voices echoed in my head. They weren't a plea or a warning. They were a command. My body refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. The hum in my ears turned into a high-pitched screech, and the world around me seemed to blur, like reality itself was slipping out of focus. My vision dimmed, and in the distance I saw them. The figures stood on the water, their forms shimmering like heat waves, impossibly tall and imposing. They didn't need to move toward me to make their presence known. They were, in my mind, overwhelming me with images and sensations I couldn't comprehend. It was like they were showing me something, forcing me to understand. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally came to, the object was still in my hand, and the figures were gone. The lake was calm, the night eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The object felt heavier now, its warmth gone, replaced by a coldness that seeped into my skin. I drove home in a daze, unable to remember how I got there. When I stepped inside, I felt it immediately, an absence. The hum was gone, the shadows were gone, and for the first time in months I felt alone. But it wasn't relief, it was dread. Because deep down, I knew they hadn't left. They were just waiting. The silence that followed was almost worse than the encounters. Without the hum or the shadows, my house felt hollow, like something vital had been stripped away. At first, I tried to convince myself it was over. I told myself they'd taken what they needed, done whatever they'd planned, and moved on. But that emptiness, it wasn't peace. It was the quiet before a storm, and I felt it in every fiber of my being. I started noticing strange things around the house. Objects slightly out of place, lights flickering for no reason, and the black object no matter where I hit it, always seemed to end up back in my hands. I'd wake up clutching it, my fingers frozen around its cold surface. The dreams continued, but they weren't like before. They were darker, more fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I saw myself standing in a blinding, white room surrounded by figures I couldn't look at directly. Machines hummed around me, their strange rhythmic sounds matching the hum that had haunted me for so long. I could feel their presence, their cold, analytical focus on me, and then pain. A searing, unbearable pain in my head, my chest, my entire body, like they were dismantling me from the inside out. I always woke up gasping for air, the memory of the dream fading but the fear lingering, clinging to me like a second skin. Then, one night, it all stopped. No hum, no shadows, no figures at the edge of my vision. Nothing. I woke up to a dead silence that felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the absence of presence. I should have felt relieved, but instead I was terrified. The black object was gone, not in the drawer, not in my hands. Just gone, as if it had never been there at all. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that my mind had finally cracked under the weight of everything I'd experienced. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw them, the scars. The geometric patterns were still there, etched into my skin like a signature, a reminder that they hadn't left me behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The hum never returned, and the figures haven't shown themselves again. But I can feel them. It's like they're just out of reach, watching, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes I catch glimpses of shadows moving where they shouldn't be, or hear faint whispers in the dead of night, but they never stay long enough for me to be sure. All I know is that whatever started in the Kalahari didn't end there. It's a part of me now, and I don't think I'll ever truly be free of it. Maybe I was never supposed to be. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the night they took my soul. I remember the first time I woke up to complete darkness, unable to feel the weight of my own body. It wasn't like being blindfolded or lost in the night. It was more like my entire self was suspended in a void. The air was thick, suffocating, as though something tangible was pressing against my chest, but I couldn't find the strength to move or even scream. It started with this low hum, like the sound you'd hear if you pressed your ear to the earth, but it came from everywhere. Then the cold hit me, not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, but one that digs straight into your soul, making you feel hollow, like an empty shell. That's when I saw them. They didn't walk in or materialize like you'd see in a movie. They were just suddenly there. Tall, scaled beings with eyes that seemed alive with malice. Reptilian. Their presence wasn't just terrifying, it was overwhelming. It felt like they were pressing into my thoughts, peeling away every layer of who I was. My instincts screamed for me to fight, but my body wasn't mine anymore. I was paralyzed, and worse, I felt seen in a way that was beyond physical. As they closed in, I became aware of this intense, throbbing pain, not in my head, but deeper, like my very essence was being gripped and pulled. It's hard to put into words, but it felt as if they weren't looking at me, but through me, searching for something they believed was hidden. The leader, if I can call it that, stepped closer, its eyes gleaming like molten gold. Without speaking, I heard it, a voice inside my mind, hollow and alien, telling me that the body was insignificant, What matters is within, it said. That's when I realized they weren't interested in my physical form at all. They were after something else. My soul. I could feel them pulling, like claws scraping at the edges of something I didn't even know I had. I've been through pain before. Broken bones, deep cuts. But this was entirely different. It was as if they were trying to tear away my identity. Everything that made me, me. Panic surged through me, but it was useless. No matter how hard. I tried to resist. I was trapped, helpless, like prey caught in a predator's jaws. The air grew thicker, the hum louder, until it felt like my entire being was unraveling. The sensation of being ripped apart wasn't just physical. It was like they were dragging out every memory, every emotion, and holding it up to the light to examine it. I could feel pieces of myself slipping away, fragments of who I was being stripped and dissected. At some point, I realized I wasn't even breathing anymore. My body felt like an empty husk, but my consciousness, my soul, was still there, raw and exposed, being clawed at by these creatures. The leader leaned closer, and for a moment, our eyes locked. There was no empathy, no hesitation, just a cold, calculated hunger. It wasn't like they hated me, but rather that I was just a resource, something to be harvested. That was almost worse than if they had shown malice. To them, I was nothing more than an object, a vessel carrying the only thing they truly wanted. The thought of being consumed, of losing myself entirely, sent a wave of sheer terror crashing over me. But even that fear felt like it was being drained, used as fuel for whatever they were doing. Then, out of nowhere, something shifted. It wasn't because of anything I did. I was too far gone to fight back. But the room, or whatever space I was in, seemed to ripple. It was like a sudden jolt in the atmosphere, as if some invisible force had disrupted their control. The reptilians stopped, their heads snapping up in unison, their golden eyes darting around as if they were searching for the source of the disturbance. For a fleeting moment, I felt their grip on me weaken. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to pull myself back, at least a little. I clung desperately to any fragment of myself I could find, trying to piece together the edges of my mind. The hum that had been building to a deafening roar suddenly fell silent, replaced by a strange pulsing vibration that seemed to come from deep within me. I don't know where it came from or why, but it felt like my soul was fighting back. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, or maybe it was just defiance. Whatever it was, it caught their attention. The leader's gaze snapped back to me, and I could feel its frustration, like an electric charge in the air. It wasn't anger. It was colder, sharper, like the annoyance of a predator when its prey refuses to go down easily. The others moved, closer, their movements unnaturally synchronized, their clawed hands reaching toward me. The pulsing sensation inside me grew stronger, pushing back against the icy pull of their grip. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something deep within me was resisting them, something primal and untouchable. I was terrified, shaking, but at the same time, I felt this strange surge of clarity. I wasn't just a body or even a mind. Whatever they were after, it was tied to something they couldn't fully control. The leader tilted its head, studying me with a curiosity that made my skin crawl. Its voice rang in my mind again, more insistent this time, telling me to surrender, to let go. But I didn't. I couldn't. I clung to that flicker of resistance with everything I had, even as their presence bore down on me like a crushing weight. The tension in the room, or the void, or whatever this place was, reached a breaking point. The pulsing inside me was now like a drumbeat, loud and defiant, pushing against their invasive presence. I could see the frustration growing in their movements, their fluid, almost mechanical synchronization faltering. The leader stretched out its hand, and I felt an intense, searing pressure in my chest, like it was trying to tear something loose. The pain was indescribable, as though every fiber of my being was unraveling. I screamed, not out loud but in my mind, desperate to hold on to whatever was left of me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pressure stopped. The leader pulled back, its eyes narrowing, and I could sense its confusion. It was as if it couldn't understand why it hadn't succeeded. The others backed away, their movements hesitant, almost reluctant. For the first time, I felt a shift in the power dynamic. They weren't in complete control anymore, and they knew it. That realization gave me just enough courage to focus on one thing: survival. The air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the space itself was reacting to the struggle between us. The reptilians began to move in circles around me, their golden eyes glowing with what I can only describe as an eerie determination. It wasn't over. I could feel their energy, their hunger, still clawing at me. But now it was different. Less focused, more desperate. My body, or at least what I could still feel of it, felt like it was floating in a dense, sticky fog. Every nerve screamed at me to stay alert, but my mind was slipping, exhausted from the constant push and pull. Then, the hum returned. It was deeper this time, vibrating through my core, almost like the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I realized they were trying something different, a more forceful approach. The leader raised both hands, and I felt an overwhelming pull, like I was being dragged toward something vast and endless. The pain was excruciating, but through the agony, I could sense that whatever they were trying to take, they still couldn't quite reach it. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, not blinding, but warm, like a faint glow from somewhere deep inside me. It wasn't something I could see with my eyes, but something I felt, as though a barrier had formed around the last pieces of my soul they hadn't managed to touch. The reptilians froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. The leader's expression, if you could call it that, shifted to something I hadn't seen before: fear. It wasn't fear of me, though. It was fear of whatever had awakened inside me. The light grew brighter, pulsing in time with the hum, and I could feel the pressure they'd been exerting begin to dissipate. It was as though the very thing they were trying to steal was now repelling them. I didn't understand it, but I could feel its strength, its defiance, pushing back against their presence. The reptilians started to retreat, their movements jerky and hesitant, like they were being pulled away by an unseen force. The leader lingered for a moment longer, its eyes locked on me, before turning and vanishing into the darkness. When they were gone, the space around me didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, like the residue of their presence still lingered. The hum faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence that made my ears ring. I didn't know if I was free or if they were waiting to strike again. My body felt like it had been wrung out, every muscle weak and trembling, though I wasn't even sure I had a body anymore. Slowly, the darkness began to shift, taking on faint shapes and shadows. I wasn't back in my room, or anywhere familiar. The place was featureless, with walls that seemed to ripple and pulse, like they were alive. My instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My heart, or whatever was left of it, pounded in my chest as I waited for something to happen. I kept expecting them to return, but instead I felt the strange light within me growing stronger. It wasn't warm or comforting, but it felt like a shield, protecting me from whatever might come next. Then, without warning, I was falling. Not in the way you fall in a dream, where you snap awake just before you hit the ground, but in a slow, weightless spiral. The space around me shifted, morphing into a whirlwind of shadows and faint, flickering lights. My senses were overwhelmed. Sounds, smells, and flashes of images that didn't belong to me bombarded me from every direction. It was as if I was being expelled from their realm, pushed out of a dimension I was never meant to see. As terrifying as it was, there was also relief, a sense that I was slipping through their grasp. When the falling finally stopped, I landed hard, the impact jarring and disorienting. I was back in my room, or at least it looked like my room. The familiar walls, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains, everything was as it should be, but it didn't feel right. The air was too still, too cold, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. My body ached as I struggled to sit up, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Was it over? Or was this just another layer of their manipulation? I sat there in the silence, trying to convince myself that I was safe, but something felt wrong. My skin prickled with an unnatural sensation like static electricity running just beneath the surface. The room wasn't entirely dark. The faint moonlight from the window cast soft shadows on the walls, but one shadow didn't move the way it should have. It was darker, sharper, and it didn't shift with the light. My chest tightened as I stared at it, willing it to disappear. But the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something, faintly humanoid but twisted, watching me from the corner. Its presence wasn't physical. It was something I felt, more than saw, and the sheer weight of it was suffocating. My instincts told me not to move, not to look away, as if breaking eye contact would make it worse. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a soundless vibration that echoed through my mind. "You're marked." The phrase wasn't a threat. It was a statement, cold and definitive, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could react, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone in the room. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Marked?" I whispered to myself, the word tasting foreign and heavy on my tongue. My hands trembled as I turned on the lamp beside my bed, flooding the room with light. It did little to ease my fear. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I looked down at my hands, and that's when I saw it. A faint glowing pattern etched into the skin of my forearm. It wasn't a tattoo or a burn. It was something deeper, something that pulsed faintly in time with my heartbeat. My stomach churned with dread as I realized that whatever they had done, whatever they had tried to take, they had left their mark on me. The glowing mark on my forearm wasn't just a pattern. It felt alive. The faint pulse wasn't random. It seemed synchronized with the beat of something greater, like it was tethered to a rhythm I couldn't fully comprehend. I touched it hesitantly, expecting it to burn or sting, but it didn't. Instead, a wave of nausea washed over me as a flood of images flashed in my mind. They weren't memories, at least not mine. I saw strange landscapes bathed in a pale, eerie light, massive structures that defied logic, and beings that looked like the reptilians but different, older, more powerful. The visions came and went so quickly that I could barely process them, but they left behind an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if I was glimpsing something ancient and unknowable, something I was never meant to see. I yanked my hand away from the mark, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, and the images stopped. I stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to get away from my room and the oppressive feeling that clung to it. The harsh fluorescent light flickered on as I stared at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, gaunt, my eyes wide with fear, but it was my arm that held my attention. The glowing mark was still there, faint but undeniable. I tried scrubbing it with soap and water, but it didn't fade. I even clawed at it with my nails, hoping it was just some illusion that I could scrape away, but it remained untouched. As I stood there, trembling and defeated, I noticed something else in the mirror. My reflection didn't move the way it should have. It was subtle at first, a delayed tilt of the head, a faint smirk that I wasn't making, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. I froze, unable to look away as my reflection leaned closer, its expression twisting into something cold and predatory. It mouthed a single word that I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Soon. Then it snapped back to normal, mimicking my movements again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I backed away from the mirror, my entire body trembling, the word soon echoing in my mind. It didn't matter how much I tried to tell myself it wasn't real. Everything about it felt too vivid, too deliberate. I turned off the bathroom light and bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I sat on the bed, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the faint glow of the mark on my arm. My thoughts spiraled. What did they want? What did they mean by marked? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over? I checked the time on my phone, 3:47 a.m. The world outside my window was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the entire night was holding its breath. I kept expecting something to happen, another hum, another flicker of shadow, but nothing did. The silence dragged on, heavy and oppressive, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, it was daylight. The sun streamed through. The curtains, warm and comforting in a way that almost made me believe everything had been a bad dream. But as I sat up, the weight of what had happened came crashing back. My arm still bore the glowing mark, though it had dimmed slightly, and my body ached with a deep, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could fix. I tried to go about my day, but nothing felt normal. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer, every moment tainted by the memory of that night. And then there was the mark. It pulsed faintly, a constant reminder that I hadn't escaped, unscathed. Even now I can feel it, like a whisper in the back of my mind, a presence that refuses to leave. I don't know what they did to me or what they want, but one thing is certain. They're not done. Whatever they started that night, whatever they were trying to take, they're coming back for it. And when they do, I don't think I'll be able to stop them. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.